So what does it mean to study the science of religion? I'm going to take this in two parts. Let's start with the religion part of things. I have a PhD in religious studies. The weird thing about my field is that it's one of the few fields I know of where we can't agree on what it is we study. One of those controversial issues in religious studies is, how do you define religion? Can you define religion? Is it useful to define religion? Is there any such thing as religion? There have been all sorts of definitions attempted. I think most people, their folk idea of what religion is it has to do with supernatural beings. So you believe in supernatural beings, and that's one definition that's out there. Other people define it as having to do with the sacred, so anything having to do with the holy or the sacred. Other people think religion really has more to do with practice, and we want to define it in terms of rituals or communities. Communities may be bound together by certain beliefs, but what's important in some people's view is what people do together, what sort of rituals they practice. So this is an incredibly contentious area in religious studies. As we'll hear from some of my colleagues in this module, one of the powers of the cognitive science of religion approach is that it sidesteps the whole definitional issue. We're going to fractionate what people are tempted to call religion into different types of beliefs or practices. So the advantage of this is we don't have to define religion in advance. We will look at any sort of phenomenon that people are inclined to call religion. And really, religion understood this way is probably a kind of radial category. So cognitive scientists talk about a radial category where it's not a box and something's either in the box or out of the box. It's more like there's a prototype. So when people think about birds, for instance, in North America, what they have in their mind is a picture of something like a finch or a robin. If you ask them, is a penguin a bird or is an ostrich a bird, they'll go, yeah, I guess so. They're not happy about it because it's not a prototypical bird. So there's radial categories. There's a prototype that's a clear example. And then there's things that fall at various distances from that prototype. So I think with regard to religion, there are clear cases. So we look at something like the Pope conducting a mass. That's clearly religious. We look at people in China doing ancestor worship. That seems pretty religious. I was recently on a train from Worcester, Massachusetts to Boston on a game day. The train was flooded by Red Sox fans, and they were really fired up. They're all going to Fenway. Is that religion for some of these people? I don't know. It takes on something that gives them a kind of meaning to their lives that someone might be tempted to call religion. Is Marxism understood a certain way a religion? Is environmentalism understood a certain way a kind of religion? The fact that we're not going to define religion allows us to explore all these possibilities. We're looking at certain types of beliefs and attitudes, and different types of groups of people, different periods of time may fall somewhere on the spectrum. So we're not trying to predefine what religion is. Okay, that takes care of the second part, religion. What about science of religion? First of all, we want to be clear about what we're not talking about, and this is sometimes called science and religion. There is a set of disagreements, discussions, discourses around what might be called science and religion. This typically focuses on how you reconcile the claims of science with the claims of specific religion. So how do you reconcile the theory of evolution with creationism? So these are all interesting and important questions, but this is not what we're doing in this series. Here we're going to be looking at the science of religion, so drawing on tools and methodologies from the sciences, theoretical frameworks from the sciences, and applying them to the problem of how do we understand and analyze religious belief and behavior. So one other aspect of the science of religion is that we're studying religion from the perspective of what's called methodological naturalism. And my colleagues will be talking about this later on in the module. It's a position where we bracket the truth claims of religion. So we're analyzing the phenomenon of religion based on what we empirically know about the world, what we can empirically verify about the world. And that involves bracketing claims about the existence of gods or supernatural rewards in the afterlife. We're going to focus on what the tools of science can actually reveal about the world around us. Now, as you'll see, some of my colleagues believe that what it means to bracket the truth claims of religion is just to put them to one side. We're not saying whether they're true or false. We're just saying for now we're not going to consider these truth claims while we go about our work. I actually take a stronger view on what it means to bracket the truth claims of religion. I do think that the reason we adopt methodological naturalism as a framework in the first place is actually making some kind of statement about the truth claims of religion. So we adopt methodological naturalism because so far the naturalistic, empirical approach to studying the world has proved the most effective way to gain reliable knowledge. So there are two main components to the scientific study of religion. The first is evolutionary theory. So we're going to be assuming a neo-Darwinian model of evolution. So this is not social Darwinism. This is Darwin's ideas about natural selection coupled with our modern scientific knowledge about how genes work and technical aspects of how selection works. So according to the neo-Darwinian model of human behavior and thought, it is shaped by adaptive pressures in our evolutionary environment. We'll also be exploring more recent gene culture coevolutionary models. So these are models that are arguing that thought and behavior is shaped not just by our genes. We have this descent from our ancestors where we inherit genes, we inherit certain types of behavior and thought, but we also inherit culture. It's sometimes called dual inheritance theory. There are two channels of transmission of information through the generations. One are the genes and one is culture. Anytime we talk about the evolution of religion, it's important to emphasize that we're not talking about teleology here. So we're not talking about a process that's tending toward some goal. There's no end point. It's not a story about progress. Evolution is just heritable variation followed by selection pressures. That's it. There's no direction to it. There's no intention behind it. It's a process that could be random. It sometimes trends in one direction depending on adaptive pressures, but it doesn't have to. There could be many different solutions to adaptive pressures. So some people get upset when we talk about the evolution of religion because it conjures up images of kind of 19th century religious theory that talked about the religions of the world as if they were all way stations on the way to the perfection of human spirituality, which was, of course, the Anglican Church. All the religions of the world were measured against how close they were to the perfection, the pinnacle of Anglicanism. That's not what we're talking about in this course. If we talk about the evolution of religion, we're not talking about some story about progress, and we're also not talking about any kind of intentional process. Second component of the scientific study of religion is cognitive science. So it's basically an approach that assumes that the mind is not just a blank slate that can have anything written on it. It's a model that assumes that the mind's been shaped by evolution to have a certain structure and to be expecting a certain type of input, a certain type of information coming in. So when we look at religious thought and behavior from a cognitive scientific perspective, we can see two things. We can see, first of all, how religious belief and behavior may be a byproduct or a natural offshoot of tendencies that evolve for other purposes. And we can also see how the transmission of religious knowledge, the sharing of religious knowledge, is going to be filtered by the innate constraints of the human mind. Now, one organizing question of this series is, why is there religion? Why do human beings have religion? And this is a question that becomes a question only when you're approaching religion from a scientific perspective. If you're approaching religion from a theological perspective, as a member of a tradition, assuming the truth claims of that tradition, there's nothing puzzling about religion at all. Why do we have religion? Because there's God. We have religion because there's God, and we got to serve God. If you're inside a religious tradition, there's no mystery about where religion comes from. It's only when you adopt a naturalistic stance, when you adopt a stance that's bracketing the truth claims of religion, that religion becomes a puzzling phenomenon. And this is because religious belief and behavior is often very costly. And it's costly in a way that doesn't seem to bring any real benefits. Again, bracketing the idea that there are benefits being brought by the gods when you sacrifice to them. So to give you some examples, in small-scale societies, an enormous amount of material resources, so food, valuable items, are sacrificed to the gods. They're burned and given up to the gods in that way. They're buried in graves. They're rendered unusable by people. People spend an enormous amount of time, so they're sacrificing time to engage in very lengthy rituals, and lengthy and often very boring rituals, so things that are actually kind of cognitively costly. People observe taboos that they believe are demanded by spiritual beings and give up some wonderful things like pork. Pork is delicious. People sacrifice delicious foodstuffs in order to show their devotion to their gods. People then engage in all sorts of scarification practices. So they scarify, they tattoo themselves, they cut off the foreskin of their penis. Why would you do this? From a theological perspective, it's because God told us to do it. But again, from a naturalistic perspective, it's puzzling why people would engage in these kind of behaviors. Even if you're a religious insider, and so you believe you have an answer for why people in your religion do the various costly things they do, because God exists and He asks us to do these things, you have to be puzzled why other people in other religions do the crazy things that they do, because you apparently don't believe their gods exist as well. So this is a mystery, why people engage in costly behavior that doesn't seem to have any direct practical benefit. When you get into large-scale societies, so when you start to get large agricultural communities, it gets even crazier. So in large-scale societies, people are doing all that stuff that they were doing in small-scale societies. They're scarifying themselves, they're observing taboos. They're also then creating enormous religious monuments. They're creating pyramids. In early China, the period I study, they are building these enormous, basically underground palaces. Calling them a tomb is a misnomer in a sense. Any of you have seen pictures of the first emperor of Qin's tomb with the terracotta army. This is what these things look like. They're enormous. They're enormous underground cities. It took a huge workforce, years, decades to build these things. And then they bury massive amounts of wealth in the ground. They bury jade, gold. They create these very elaborate bronze vessels and then just bury them in the ground with dead people. They're taking a significant percentage of their gross national product and burying it in the ground with dead people. If you look at ancient Egypt, they're building these enormous pyramids that have no pragmatic function. They're not doing anything. They're not defensive fortifications. They're not helping people store grain. They're not doing anything that would help you in a practical manner. They're taking up an enormous amount of the workforce of the society. Why do societies do this? And this is common. You find this across the world in large-scale societies. Massive monumental religious architecture, huge amounts of sacrifices, including human sacrifices to the gods or to the dead. Why is this happening? On an individual perspective, you'd expect that people who are not subject to religious beliefs would do better than those that were. So if you're an individual who believes in the gods and you're observing taboos and you're foregoing delicious foodstuffs because you think the gods told you to do that, you're scarifying yourself in ways that could lead to infection and cause dangerous health complications, you're spending an enormous amount of time in front of idols, bowing to them and singing songs and worshiping them, you would think that if I'm an individual who doesn't do any of that, and I'm spending that time fishing and catching more fish than you are, I should do better than you. On the scale of cultures or groups, you'd imagine that groups that instead of building enormous underground palaces or pyramids, spent that same energy building defensive fortifications or irrigation canals or grain storage facilities would outcompete groups that were essentially wasting all of these resources. So it's puzzling on both an individual and a group level why religious behavior and belief exists. So we'll be exploring some of the proposed answers to this puzzle. Why do we have religious belief and behavior? There's the pure byproduct answer. So in other words, religious belief and practice is a mistake. So we have cognitive tendencies that evolve for other purposes, and they just happen to kick off religious belief as a side product. So looked at that way, religion in a sense is a mistake. It's an overfiring of certain cognitive tendencies that we have that doesn't have any adaptive function. It really is puzzling in terms of a payoff structure, but the reason it exists is because the original function pays for itself. So we have this cognitive function that evolved because it does some important work, say in social cognition, and then it overfires and produces religious beliefs. One other hypothesis out there is that there is no benefit to religion. There's no payoff for the cost. It's actually a meme, a cultural virus, if you want to think of it this way. So religious beliefs and practices arise. They're good at getting into people's brains, and they're good at getting those people who have them in their brains to spread them to other people, but they don't actually help the people they're infecting. So in this view, the evil meme view of religious belief, cultural ideas, religious cultural ideas are there to propagate themselves. In the same way a virus in your body just wants to propagate itself. It's using you as a way to create copies of itself. Religious ideas infect people's minds and then use people to spread themselves. But the reason that religion persists and spreads is not because it's doing anything for human beings. It actually could be a very negative thing for human beings. It's because these ideas are catchy, and once people have them, they tend to spread them to others. So according to both the byproduct and meme theory of religion, religion has no adaptive function. Finally, there's what we could call the social control hypothesis about religion. So religion is functional, but only for a certain group. So it's a creation of a priestly class. It's a set of beliefs and practices that are foisted upon the populace in order to allow a small elite group to manipulate and control the rest of society. So according to this view, religion is adaptive, but only for a small proportion of the population. There are also a variety of adaptive hypotheses about religion. So there's individual level adaptive theories. Individual adaptationist theories hold that religious beliefs and practices are beneficial for the individual in a variety of ways. And we'll look at all the various permutations of these theories. So for instance, terror management theory argues that the fear of death and the fear of uncertainty paralyzes human beings. It has a negative effect on humans' ability to motivate themselves and to make long-term plans. And religious beliefs are adaptive in the sense that they give us a sense of structure or a sense of meaning that allows us to both be motivated and to pursue courses of action that take a long time to realize. It allows us to maintain motivation over long periods of time and damp down the terror we would feel if we didn't have religious beliefs. So in this sense, they're a kind of psychic cushioning. So there are also group adaptation theories, so hypotheses that argue that religious belief and practice are useful at the group level, useful for binding groups together effectively and allowing them to outcompete other groups, even though they may actually be not beneficial for the individuals in those groups. It doesn't matter because the group dynamic swamps the individual dynamic in a certain sense. It's also, of course, possible that all of these sorts of factors are involved. So it could be that religion is adaptive in various ways at the individual level and could also have group functions. And these could sometimes come into conflict or they could sometimes be working together. So we're going to be trying to untangle this web, and we'll be looking at all the various individual and group adaptationist theories about religion. So one of the features of this course is that we'll be hearing from all the major players in the field of cognitive science or religion. We'll be hearing about cutting-edge research, and in most cases from the actual researchers themselves. And so you'll emerge from this class with a really solid grasp of the fundamentals of the cognitive science of religion. So we'll be looking at the question of what are the origins of religious belief and practice, where does it come from, why is it part of human psychology. We'll be talking about why world religions have developed in the way they have, why there's patterns of development over time, where certain religions, so the Abrahamic faiths, Buddhism, spread. They've been growing, taking over parts of the world that they didn't exist in before. Why is that? Is there something about these religions that make them particularly apt for spreading, either because they're memes and they are good at infecting people's minds, or because people who have these beliefs are able to outcompete or convert people who don't have these beliefs? We'll be looking at the issue of secularism and atheism. So if religion is a cognitive natural thing for human beings, how are we to explain secularism or atheism? So we'll be looking at the phenomenon of people who claim they're spiritual but not religious. So what does it mean to be spiritual and not religious? But also atheism. And atheism has existed. There were ancient atheists in ancient Greece and ancient China. I'm an atheist, so atheists exist, and we're going to have to explain the existence of atheism. What's the connection of religion to violence, to cultural chauvinism, to cultural conflict? On the obverse side, is there any connection of religion to cooperation, people's ability to be pro-social? Is there any connection between religion and morality? So if you're not personally religious, you should be curious about why religion exists and why it's so important in the world. If you are personally religious, you may be interested just from an intellectual perspective. Also, if you don't want to bracket the truth claims of your own religious tradition, you must still be curious about why people across the world and throughout history have believed the wild variety of things they believe. So one of the things you'll learn in this course is how that variety gets generated and how religious cultural evolution happens and why it tends to kick up certain types of forms and why those forms tend to move through history in certain ways. So that brings us to the end of Module 1, Lecture 1. We'll continue our journey in Lecture 2. I look forward to seeing you there.